Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's amazing to see that so many people have given up their Saturday mornings to be here. First of all, I'd like to thank the British Council for inviting me here to Yerevan. This is the first time that I've actually been here, and I hope that we'll have a chance to look around the city and to get to know it better. So I'm going to talk to you today about CPD. And when Ade first invited me to talk about this, it was back in the summer, and I was in Britain visiting family and friends, and many of my friends, like myself, are teachers. And so I met up with one of my friends and I said, I'm going to Armenia to do a talk on CPD. And he goes, oh yeah, all right then. And so we started to talk about it, and he had some quite interesting observations for me. First of all, he told me this simply amazing fact about the amount of money that is spent on CPD in England every year. Right, get ready for this. £200 million. That's a lot of money in any country, £200 million. That's not for the United Kingdom, that's not for Great Britain, that's just for England. And I said, oh wow, and I sort of felt quite proud to think that my home country was investing so much money in CPD. And then he said, but the catch is that in his opinion, and in the opinion of a lot of teachers, it was not money well spent. And he had lots of anecdotal evidence of teachers going away, attending seminars, attending workshops, and coming back with very little benefit. Sorry about that. I feel a bit like a spaceman with all of these wires. So anyway, £200 million, and it seems that not a lot of it is being particularly well spent if teachers are going away on seminars and coming back and not really having any concrete benefit from it, because there was no sort of evidence in the classroom that there was any improvement in the teacher outcomes and in the learner outcomes. And he actually believed that sometimes teachers come back not with more learning, but they can actually be weaker because they haven't fully grasped the principles that were involved in the CPD courses that they went on, and that they were misapplying them in their lessons. So this is really quite a worrying state of affairs, and it got me thinking a bit more about why I'll keep going. As you've probably seen, I've never used one of these things before. Anyway, it seems that when it comes to CPD, that we take a lot of things for granted. Just because we provide CPD opportunities, it doesn't mean automatically that teachers are going to benefit from them. Okay? Because there are many formidable obstacles in the way of any effective CPD. We can't just introduce programs and say, oh, this is fine now, we have a program in place, so therefore our teachers automatically will improve the way in which they teach. It just doesn't work like that. And CPD needs to be effective. So first of all, what I want to do is to look honestly at some of the obstacles that face teachers and which face institutions when it comes to CPD. Okay, here are our obstacles. Now the first one, let's be really honest. Let's be really honest about this. Teachers have a lot to do. Besides the contact hours that you have every day, you also have to prepare those lessons. And I remember, when I was a newly qualified teacher, preparing lessons, drawing up lesson plans was an incredibly time-consuming task. It took a lot of time, it took a lot of energy, it took a lot of resources. And then, on top of that, there is the work that is generated during the actual teaching process. So principally here, I'm talking about marking and assessment. And a lot of my colleagues and friends in Britain who are teachers constantly complain about the amount of marking that they have to do. You know, they say that basically weekends are often devoted to marking. And then, on top of the preparation, on top of the teaching, on top of the marking, there are a whole series of administrative tasks which need to be undertaken by teachers in schools, completing registers, compiling reports. It goes on. And if we're going to be honest about CPD, we're going to have to say that institutions need to make time for CPD, because all of the workload that I've spoken about only refers to the professional lives of teachers, but teachers also have personal lives. Teachers are, you know, mothers and husbands and fathers, brothers and sisters, etc. They have their own personal lives that they need to live as well. So any frank conversation about CPD needs to take into account that teachers already have a heavy workload, and if we're going to be honest about it, we need to make time for CPD. Now, when we're talking about the development of teachers and about teachers learning, then there are tremendous similarities with any other kind of learning. So, for instance, learning a language. And I think that nearly every teacher would say that when it comes to learning a language, the key thing is motivation. That if you don't have motivation, it's going to be very difficult for you to learn effectively. And if teachers are going to develop effectively and to be able to teach better so that learners can learn better, then they have to be motivated as well. And again, institutions need to look at the levels of teacher motivation. Besides the workload, of course, many teachers have to work in quite challenging circumstances. I'm based in Croatia, and in the capital city, Zagreb, it is not uncommon for teachers to have to teach classes of 38 pupils. My colleagues in Britain, particularly in London, complain about the challenging behaviour of many of the students in their classes. And finally, there's the question which won't go away, which is of pay. And at the moment in Croatia, I was talking to Simon that many of my colleagues in secondary schools are actually on strike at the moment because the salary of teachers in Croatia is below the national average. So in a situation where teachers have to teach very large classes, there can be bad behaviour, and they're not being paid very much, it can, again, it's very challenging for them to undertake CPD. And we have to be frank about this, that if we're going to get teachers to develop, we need to make sure that they're motivated, because motivation is really the key when it comes to any form of learning. Okay, I've already touched upon the money, but you know, it's not as straightforward as you might think, because money pervades everything when it comes to CPD. So, for instance, if we're going to send a bunch of teachers on a course, some people have to teach their class while they're away. Arranging cover costs money. Even something like peer observation programs. One person is teaching, the other person is observing, but who's teaching the observer's class? Again, it needs cover, it needs money. Organising courses, bringing in consultants, giving people access to online courses, it all costs money. And resources as well. We live in a world in which our CPD landscape is radically changing all the time. Teachers have never had such opportunities to access content online, etc. But again, providing this access in certain places where maybe not everybody has access to the internet, or there aren't enough laptops, etc. in the classroom, it all costs money. So, before we even start our CPD, we have to realise that we are confronted with these formidable obstacles of the workload, the motivation, and this question of money. But it doesn't end there, of course. There are further obstacles. Planning. Now, Obviously, planning should assist CPD, but unfortunately, a lot of the evidence suggests that when planning goes wrong, CPD goes really wrong. I'd like to share an anecdote with you about Britain. I was told by a colleague about an institution which had arranged some CPD for newly and recently qualified teachers. Great. Who needs CPD more than recently and newly qualified teachers? And it was specifically targeted at them, so that's great too. And when did they have this course? At the end of the school year, which meant that the teachers had to go all the way through the year before they actually got that input that was specifically designed for them. I mean, you know, obviously it should have come at the beginning. I mean, this is, you know, we have this saying in English about the horse has left the stable and then you close the door afterwards. That's a classic example of that particular idiom. So planning or poor planning, again, can hinder professional development among teachers. And lastly, there is this question of opportunities. Opportunities for teachers are not even across any kind of society. And in some societies, it can be really challenging for teachers to even access CPD opportunities. So as I said, I'm based in Croatia, and Croatia has a rather long and indented coastline, and as anybody from Croatia is always keen to tell you, it has more than 1,000 islands, and about 100 of these islands are actually populated, and many of them are sufficiently populated as to have schools, etc. And on one occasion, I was involved in a CPD event in the city of Dubrovnik, right in the south. You might have seen it on television. I gather it was used as the location for the series Game of Thrones. But anyway, Dubrovnik. And I got talking to one of the teachers, and I said, oh, you know, where do you come from? And she told me that she came from one of these islands, and it had taken her 5 hours just to reach the location of the event. So she'd had to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning. I don't even know why she bothered going to bed, to be honest. 3 o'clock in the morning to catch a bus to the port on that island, and then catch a ferry across the Adriatic to Dubrovnik, take part in the CPD opportunity, and then go back another 5 hours. So a 10-hour round journey on a Saturday. You know, no teacher, nobody should have to undertake that kind of journey to undertake a professional development opportunity. And of course, this is going to be a real problem in countries where you have isolated communities in rural areas. So just physical distance itself can be a huge obstacle when it comes to CPD. And these opportunities are not just geographical. In my experience, it's been quite sad sometimes to see how in a certain institution the same teachers get selected for the same opportunities again and again, which of course is going to be very demotivating for those people who are overlooked. So what often happens is particular teachers, they go off, receive face-to-face training, and they come back and they cascade that training to the other teachers. Now, of course, that's a useful CPD activity, you know, particularly for the people doing the cascading, but it's going to be less motivating if you're always one of the people who has to stay behind and never gets the opportunities. So, before we even start looking at CPD, we really need to acknowledge that there are formidable obstacles, and that we can't just take it for granted that CPD will just happen because we set up some courses, etc. What I want to talk about now is what we can actually do to make sure that CPD is effective. Now, the first thing I'm going to say is a blindingly obvious thing, but we need to think about it a bit, and that is effective CPD needs to be a priority. And I think that one of the problems is that in many institutions that I've had the experience of working for or with, is that what we would call lip service is paid to this, which means that everybody goes, yeah, CPD, great idea, of course. And so a certain number of CPD hours is organised. So for example, in Britain, teachers are supposed to undertake 30 hours of CPD in an academic year, and a certain amount of money needs to be spent. But what the danger is that it becomes an administrative task, an exercise in ticking boxes to say, okay, we've got to monitor, we've got to observe so many teachers. Okay, we've observed that one, tick, we've observed that one, tick, etc. Okay, we've got to spend so much, X amount of money. And at the end we can say, okay, we've met our CPD goals because we've spent that amount of money. And so there can be too much focus on the quantitative aspect of it and not enough on the qualitative aspect. So if we're going to be really serious about this, we've got to make it a priority. And we're not just talking about making it a priority from the point of view of institutions. We, as teachers, need to take responsibility for our own development. You know, I know that things like diplomas and certificates are very important and that they can be a source of motivation in themselves, but sometimes it can be quite disappointing when it seems that all that teachers want is that proof of attendance so that they can fulfill administrative requirement. Effective CPD needs to be a priority. Now, I said that any kind of teacher learning is going to be like learner learning. And I think everybody in this room would agree that if you want to teach a learner effectively, you need to find out about the learner's needs in the first place. And effective CPD cannot be a one-size-fits-all, because teachers are different. I mean, we have sort of very obvious and basic differences. Kindergarten teachers, primary school teachers, secondary school teachers, university teachers. And then within, say, secondary education, there might be different specialities. We might have teachers who teach CLIL, so content and language integrated learning. Teachers might be preparing pupils with English for academic purposes. They might be preparing pupils for exams, etc. The list goes on and on. Teachers are different, they have different needs. And even within a particular cohort of teachers, you will have newly qualified teachers, recently qualified teachers, and teachers with varying levels of experience. So it just doesn't make sense to give them training for all of them, or professional development opportunities for all of them. We need to look at their specific needs in exactly the same way that we would look at the specific needs of pupils in our classes. And I'd like to talk a little bit about an experience that I had doing this in neighbouring Georgia, in Tbilisi, where there was a private language school which had decided that it wanted to radically alter the way in which English was taught in its curriculum. And so it provided a questionnaire for the teachers to complete, because obviously one of the best ways of finding out about teachers' needs is to ask them themselves. And of course this is good practice, because a lot of research suggests that when teachers are engaged in their own professional development, they become more motivated in exactly the same way that learners become more motivated when they're engaged in drawing up their own learning. So these questionnaires were distributed, and the teachers completed them and returned them. And the results were quite surprising. I almost had this feeling that the teachers had completed it for an audience rather than for themselves, because the teachers, when asked what they felt they needed to improve most, they all said, grammar. I need to improve the way that I teach grammar, because I need to make sure that my learners can speak more accurately and can write more accurately. I need input on correcting their mistakes. So there was very much this focus on grammar and accuracy. Okay, fair enough. But the institution had provided a similar questionnaire to the learners as well, which was even more enlightening, because they asked this question, What do you think you need to work on more in your English lessons, and why do you need English? And all of these students, of course, nearly all of them, they said, well, you know, I want to access higher education opportunities in English, in universities and colleges where the language of instruction is English. So I need to be able to communicate in English. And they said, oh, I want to work in a, in a multinational company, I want to work in a bank, so it's really important that I have the opportunity to improve my English speaking skills and my presentation skills so that I can access this. They spoke about travel, they spoke about leisure, about the fact that so much of social media these days is conducted in English. And so basically what they wanted was to be able to communicate more, to have the opportunity to speak more in the classes. And when they were asked, you know, what do you do least of in your lessons, they said, speaking. And then, of course, we had another dimension when it came to addressing the needs of the teachers, which was observation, to actually go into the classes and see what was going on. And there very much was a focus on grammar translation methodology. And I saw a class in which a teacher stood up and basically lectured everybody for 45 minutes on, I'll always remember it, the past continuous, with lots of examples, etc. And the pupils sat there and they took notes. Now, obviously, in any situation when you just like listen to somebody the whole time, I'm arguing against myself now because I'm getting you to listen to me, is it can be, you know, it's a bit repetitive and it's a bit demotivating. So based on the questionnaire which had been given to the teachers, the questionnaire which had been given to the learners, and on the observations carried out, we could define what the needs of this particular group of teachers was, and it was that they needed to improve their skills in communicative language teaching. And so in any situation, because teachers are different, we need to identify their needs. And then, as a knock-on effect, any CPD needs to be tailored. It needs to be devised specifically for that group of teachers and preferably for individual teachers themselves, because the difference amongst teachers doesn't just apply to groups like newly qualified teachers or CLIL teachers, etc. Amongst individuals, there will be different strengths, and there will be different areas in need of development. So ideally, CPD needs to be tailored. So what we're talking about here, of course, is things like, you know, classroom observation is obviously a very tailored CPD opportunity because it refers to the experience of an individual teacher. Ideally, teachers should be drawing up their own CPD plans related to their own strengths and their own areas for development. So again, very specifically tailored to the developmental needs of the teachers themselves. Of course, it can be applied a bit more widely, and that we can tailor activities for a group of teachers. But it seems to me, and also I have to admit that, you know, I've been involved in such activities, that a problem with a lot of CPD is that it's just provided for too wide an audience. And when it's provided for too wide an audience, then the impact is going to be limited because it's not tailored enough. So, and often this is because it's sort of like delivered before anything else has happened. So before any observation has happened, for instance. So it makes more sense to decide what kind of workshops, what kind of online courses teachers need after there's been some kind of initial activities like observation. So getting back to my example of Tbilisi, in that case, working with the teachers, observing them, getting them to draw up individual plans, it quickly became apparent that one of the areas in which they needed some kind of input was on giving feedback to learners. So this seemed to be something which was applicable to all of them, and so we were able to give them a workshop on that. So it was something very specific, giving feedback to learners. Unfortunately, a lot of workshops are very sort of generic, things like writing skills, speaking skills. And of course, these do have benefits, but the benefits are probably not going to be as great as something which is very specifically tailored to the needs of the teachers. And of course, we mustn't forget all of the most important people in this story, the learners themselves. That any kind of CPD, obviously we want to improve the outcomes for teachers so that we can see that teachers are teaching better, but we want to see that learners are learning better, because at the end of the day, that is the most important thing. Are learners improving their performance? Are they able to do things that they weren't able to do at the beginning? So what we have here is it's like a knock-on effect. By addressing the needs of the teachers, tailoring the CPD to those needs, and tailoring it to the desired outcomes. Because it's an awful lot of money that's being spent. So getting back to the example of Britain, or England rather, £200 million. And if a lot of that money doesn't even produce any learner outcomes, well, that money could be spent on something else. How many schools could you build with that money? How many teachers could you employ with that money? How many hospitals could you employ with that money? So, it's a duty to make sure that this money is well spent, and that means that we need to see positive learner outcomes. CPD needs to revolve around the classroom. If your CPD policy isn't classroom-based, then it should be. Because any amount of theoretical knowledge, any amount of reading, any amount of attending talks like this cannot compensate for actually being in the classroom, because it's in the classroom where we really learn. If you talk to newly qualified teachers, one of the things they talk about is classroom shock. And classroom shock is the phenomenon of, you go through all of your lectures and you do all of your team practice and, you do a lot of reading, and then all of a sudden, bang, you're in the classroom. And it doesn't matter how much reading you've done, how many lectures you've attended, it's a completely different universe. And one of the previous speakers was talking about how complex teaching is. And I think that's a really good way of describing it. Nothing can prepare you for the complexity of being in the classroom. And, classroom shock is a real issue. And therefore, any kind of CPD really needs to revolve around the classroom. So what does that mean? That means activities like observation. Now, when we talk about observation, we've got different kinds of observation. It can be peer observation. It can be hierarchical, where maybe a mentor is observing a mentee. It can be flipped, so that a mentee can be observing a more experienced practitioner so that they can learn from them. But also, when we say that something is classroom-based, it doesn't have to be like a physical classroom. We don't actually have to physically be in the classroom, because these days technology offers us all sorts of wonderful opportunities. We can spend a lot of time looking at videos, for example. We can video ourselves teaching. We can see videos of our colleagues teaching. But also, when we say classroom-based, this also applies to things just like reflecting on what goes on in the classroom. So later today, Simon's going to talk to you about teacher activity groups, and I've worked with some teacher educators here in Armenia who've helped to set up these groups. And one of the great things about teacher activity groups is that teachers have the opportunity to discuss an idea, to go back to their classrooms and carry it out, and then go back to their tag group and to discuss how it went, and then refine things according to what needs to be changed, and go back and do it all again. So again, it's classroom-based. Any kind of individual plan for teacher development should be based on what goes on in the classroom. The plan should be modified, refined, according to the experience of what went on in the classroom. So nothing replaces classroom experience. Nothing replaces classroom-based CPD. Workshops are useful, articles are useful, All of these online resources are useful, but nothing is as useful as actually being there in the classroom. CPD needs to be driven by feedback. Teachers need to be informed about how they are performing. First of all, they need to be reinforced in their good practice. So when teachers do things well, they need to be told that they're doing them well, but also they need to be told why they're doing them well. Because sometimes we can actually do things well, but we might not even realise why we're doing it well and why it's important. I understand that Penny came to speak to you here a couple of years ago, and she has this phrase which I really like, where she talks about being an automatician. And I think that can always be a danger with a teacher, that we know that we should do something, so we do it, but we don't really know why we're doing it, or we stopped, or we've forgotten why we should be doing it. So it's really important to give teachers feedback on what they're doing well. And of course, just as importantly, it's really important to give teachers feedback on areas that they need to develop. Now, if Roseanne's still here, I apologise. I think she's already heard this particular anecdote. But when I think about the worst piece of feedback that I ever received in my life, we'd have to go back to the 1980s, and when I was a recently qualified teacher, and I was working at a private language school, a very large one in the centre of London, right bang in the middle of Oxford Street. And it was the policy of this school, to carry out observations of teachers, and I vividly remember the vice DOS, or vice director of studies, running around the school trying to observe as many teachers as possible in a very short period of time. And I remember him coming into my room. I was bitterly disappointed because I didn't even have the opportunity to discuss my lesson plan with him. Which of course should be an important part of any observation process. And he sat there and he seemed to make a few notes, and then as soon as my lesson was finished, he was straight out of the door. And I had to spend the next couple of days running around the school trying to grab him by the collar and say, "Oh, can I have some feedback, please?" And he went, when I finally cornered him, he said, yeah, basically it was fine. You can imagine my deflation. Like at first there was this kind of relief, because I thought, oh wow, he's not going to tear me to pieces. But then when I thought about it, I thought, what did I get out of that? Of all of the worry, the preparation and everything, I got nothing. In actual fact, I got even less than nothing, because he said basically. So yeah, basically, well, what about the other stuff? Yeah? So feedback obviously needs to be principled, so it needs to be constructive, it needs to tell people what they're doing well, but it also needs to give people areas for development. And that CPD without feedback on how you're doing isn't any kind of development at all. So effective CPD needs to revolve around the classroom and be driven by feedback on how we are doing things. Right, it's called CPD. It's not PD, it's CPD, so there's the continuing aspect, which means that effective CPD needs to be followed up. So in my example of being a young teacher in the 1980s in London, there was absolutely no follow-up whatsoever. All the boxes had been ticked, he'd observed the number of teachers that he needed to observe, and that was it. There was nothing afterwards. See, one of the problems with a lot of CPD is that it exists in isolation. So you go on a course and then you finish it and there's no follow-up. Or you're observed and that's it for the semester or the term or the year or whatever. There's no follow-up. In order to be effective, you need to see what happens afterwards, because it's an ongoing process, because learning is an ongoing process. Yeah? So if we draw another analogy with the classroom, you wouldn't go into a class and teach a specific structure or certain lexical item. Say we're going to teach the past perfect. You wouldn't teach it to a class and then afterwards come back in and expect everybody in that class to know that structure and to be able to use that structure. No, you need to follow it up. Yeah? So you need to review it in the next lesson. You need to recycle it. People need to have more opportunities to work with it. And it's exactly the same with CPD for teachers. You can't just introduce an idea to teachers and expect that they can go from the training room or from online immediately into their classroom and to be able to use those ideas. It needs to be followed up. So in an observation situation, the teacher's CPD plan needs to be changed according to the feedback that they've received in that observation, and then the next observation session should somehow be connected and linked with the previous one. So we have this element of continuity so that it's sustained. Similarly, if somebody goes on a course, we want to see some evidence that the course has been of some use, the workshop has been of some use. So, teachers need to reflect upon whether or not they've been able to use that experience. Observations should maybe be linked with whether or not that particular course has any use. Is there any evidence in the classroom? So, we need to make sure that we keep the C in CPD, that it is continuing, that it is followed up, and that it is sustained. Because learning experiences do not occur in individual items, it's part of a continuity. And learning to teach or improving as a teacher is exactly the same. And then at the end of this, we need to evaluate the whole process. Have we actually learned anything? Have our learners actually learnt anything? Have we become better teachers? Have our learners become better at learning the language? Has this money that we've spent been well spent? Has this time and effort that we've put into this, has it been worth it? Now, obviously, teachers themselves can evaluate their own CPD. Yeah? This is why reflection is so important. Did I gain anything out of today? Did I gain anything from that workshop? But also institutions have a responsibility here. If they're spending all of that money, they need to make sure that their teachers are providing better teaching. They need to make sure that their learners are learning more and more quickly. And if that's not happening, then obviously things need to change. The CPD policy needs to be adjusted. Maybe we need more of this and less of this. Maybe we need to change our CPD provider. So if we have some kind of an external consultant who's coming in and we're not getting any results, maybe we need to change it. The point is, it needs to be evaluated, because if it isn't, then why are we undertaking it in the first place? So, effective CPD revolves around the classroom, driven by feedback, it's sustained, it's ongoing, and it's evaluated, not just at the end, but periodically. Okay, this is my last 4. I keep drawing these analogies with the classroom experience, and I think that this is a really important thing to hold on to. Yeah? Learning to become a better teacher is very similar to learning to become a better speaker of a language. Now, research shows that people are more motivated in learning when they have an opportunity to share their experiences, when they have the opportunity to work together. And that is why so much work in the language classroom revolves around collaboration, so that we have pair work and group work and mingles and circle discussions and onion discussions and all of these weird and wonderful collaborative activities. And what's good for learners is also good for teachers, because when it comes to developing as teachers, sometimes it can be a bit lonely. I'm a big football fan, and this provides me with an excellent opportunity to digress momentarily into football. The French writer Camus, the guy who wrote L'Étrangère, he had this great thing about the goalkeeper being the loneliest position on the football field, because the goalkeeper is in a team, but somehow they are different from everybody else. And I think that teachers are in a similar position, because the teacher is always with other people, but somehow the teacher is alone because in the classroom, because you don't have your colleagues with you in the classroom, generally speaking. And so that's why it's even more important to engage in collaborative activities with colleagues outside of the classroom. So things like peer teaching, team teaching, peer observation, and these teacher activity groups, which Simon is going to talk to you about. The opportunity to come together and exchange knowledge, practices, advice, all kinds of tips. Now, formal structures for collaborative CPD are excellent, of course, so teacher activity groups, peer observation, etc. But an awful lot of effective CPD at the collaborative level takes place in what you're doing now. Just having the opportunity to talk to the people next to you, in front of you and behind you, in the coffee break, etc. But one of the greatest benefits you will get from an occasion like this is the opportunity to talk to each other. Because, I mean, let's face it, you're listening to me, but what do I know about your context? I've never been into your classroom. I've never had to work with any of the textbooks that you work with. I've never had to work with the pupils that you work with and face the difficulties that you face every day. But there are people in this room who have done that and who have a lot of experience and who will be able to give you some practical advice. So this is, when we talk about collaborative CPD, we're not just talking about it at the formal level, but also at the informal level. Okay? And not just physically, but also, you know, IT these days has opened up a world of opportunities to us. You can post questions on forums and get replies almost instantly. Although this, of course, carries its own danger, because there is so much information out there that, you know, we have to evaluate to what extent it is useful or not. But if something is collaborative, it's going to be more purposeful. I've already mentioned this, but effective CPD really needs to be reflective. We've got to stop, you know, it's really important not to be an automatician, to just go into the classroom and to carry out the lesson and then to come back out again without thinking about what we've done. Was it, to a certain extent, most teachers will do this, you know, was the lesson successful? Was the lesson less successful? But it's really important to ask why. Yeah? And so if it wasn't so successful, why wasn't it successful? And most importantly, what can I do to improve it next time? And really, reflection shouldn't just be about after the lesson. Reflection should even be before the lesson. When I was looking through the programme, I saw that there's a session on lesson planning. And when we draw up our lesson plans, there should always be this section about anticipated problems. You know, what kind of problems might occur in my lesson? And part of that, if we're going to reflect on it and not just be an automatician, we actually need to come up with solutions. Yeah? So these are the potential problems in my lesson, but what are my potential solutions to that going to be? So reflection needs to be going right the way through the process, even before we go into the classroom, while we're teaching, and particularly afterwards. Now, reflection has obviously become a real buzzword in CPD, and we talk about it all the time, you know, reflection this, reflection that. But in actual fact, teachers need a lot of guidance on this. It's not just, you can't just tell somebody, go away and reflect. People actually need to be taught how to reflect. They might need some, you know, templates, guidelines, etc. So CPD should really be focusing on not just giving teachers the skills for the classroom, but also on giving teachers the skills for outside of the classroom, for before the lesson and for after the lesson as well. And this is another great thing about TAG groups or teacher activity groups, because it gives teachers the opportunity to come together, to try something out, and then to reflect upon it, not just on their own, but to reflect on it with other teachers. Because it's easier to reflect on something with other people than to just reflect on it on your own, because you can bounce ideas off of people, you can get confirmation from your peers that what you thought wasn't a silly idea, it was a good idea, etc. So we need to drive CPD through reflection. Reflection needs to become normed. It needs to be something normal for teachers, but teachers need a lot of support in developing this. We need balance in CPD, just as we need balance when we teach. We talked about the importance of motivation, and most people would agree that when it comes to motivating language learners, one of the most important things is providing variety. So if you just sit and listen to somebody, so I'm arguing against myself again here. If you just listen to somebody all of the time, it's going to be demotivating because it's very repetitive. And I'm sure you'll be very glad that you only have to go through this, for 60 minutes and not again and again and next Monday. Yeah? So what's important is variety. So my grandmother she was always fond of saying, variety is the spice of life. And when we teach, of course, we want to have as much variety as possible. So even like when we do a speaking activity, if you only did it in pairs, always, it would become boring, which is why we have other patterns of interaction like mingles and group work, etc. But of course, you don't want to just do speaking in the lesson. You need to do a bit of writing, a bit of work with vocabulary, some reading and some listening. So you need balance. And it's absolutely the same with teachers. Teachers can't just attend lectures. Teachers can't just attend workshops. Teachers can't just read stuff online or read articles or engage in observation, etc. So any good CPD program needs to achieve this balance of activities so that it remains motivating for teachers. But when we talk about balance, we're not just talking about the kinds of activities that teachers do. Sometimes CPD will be driven in a top-down manner. In other words, that it's going to be determined on a hierarchical basis by ministries, by institutions, and then it's mandated to teachers. And of course, that's as it should be. But also, for the sake of balance, besides top-down, we also need to have bottom-up teacher development. So that means that we, as teachers, as professionals, we need to take responsibility for our own learning and not just leave it in the hands of institutions and in the hands of ministries. We need to think, what can I do to become a better teacher so that my learners can learn more effectively. Some CPD opportunities can be conducted alone, some can be conducted in groups, face-to-face, online. Sometimes we will get people from outside, we will get external experts. Sometimes we ourselves can provide that knowledge, because at the end of the day, nobody knows our context or nobody knows your context better than you do yourself. So throughout any kind of CPD program, it's really important to have balance in order to maintain motivation. This is my last point now. As part of taking responsibility for our own CPD, we need to step outside of the comfort zone every now and again. Now, I know I've been in that situation when I've been observed, for example, or when I've been asked to lead an activity in a teacher development session. And one of the problems can be, like by default, we go back to something that's safe. I vividly remember being observed by a senior colleague, and I'm making the decision like, okay, it's really important that nothing goes wrong in this lesson. Yeah. So I did a review lesson because I thought, well, The learners are going to know the material better. They're not going to let me down. The lesson's going to go more smoothly. I'm just going to do those activities that I always do because I know that they always work. Yeah? But really, when I reflected on it afterwards, what did I get from it? Nothing. I was kidding myself. Yeah? I wasn't actually prioritising my CPD. I was just engaged in this administrative burden of just like ticking the box. Yes, I've been observed. That's it for a few weeks. That's out of the way. But in actual fact, what had happened was a bit of a tragedy at that kind of CPD level because I'd had a great opportunity to develop, to try something new and to get some feedback from a more experienced colleague on how it went, and I missed that opportunity. And now when I have the privilege of going into so many classrooms and observing lots of teachers and going through their lesson plans with them, I do notice this as a common feature, that it's normal to be scared a bit when someone comes into our classroom. This is why it's so important to make it normal. Yeah, so that it's something that doesn't scare us, and so that we don't just, go back into our comfort zone and do the things that we know that we can do. Because it's only by trying out new things that we actually get any development. Even working with experienced teacher educators on courses where we have this thing called micro-training or micro-teaching, where the participants on the course have to teach part of a lesson to the other participants. And after a while, I realised that not everyone, that's a bit unfair, that a lot of participants, they always choose the same part of the lesson. It's the beginning, yeah, a warmer. Because warmers are pretty straightforward to deal with, really. So you see lots of activities where they carry out a brainstorming activity and put it on the board, or an activity where they organise people into pairs. So sort of quite mechanical things that they're experienced teachers. So I know that they can do those kinds of things. So to round up, we shouldn't take CPD for granted. CPD is not just going to happen because somebody says it's going to happen, because the school says it's going to happen, or because you decide that you're going to concentrate on it. Because there are formidable barriers to it. We've talked about things like workload, motivation, etc. So it's important that we don't just pay lip service to CPD. We need to think about it. We need to make sure that it's effective. So that means things like making sure that it's connected with people's needs, making sure that it's followed up, making sure that it's connected with learner outcomes, that it's driven by feedback, that it revolves around the classroom, and really importantly, that it has the C aspect of CPD, that it's continuing, that it's sustained, and then at the end that we evaluate it to see, have we been successful? Is there any evidence that we've improved as teachers? And most importantly, more importantly, that our learners have improved. CPD will be more effective if we do it with other professionals. We need to think about what we're doing, not to be an automatician. Make sure that it's balanced, a nice variety. And we need to take responsibility for it ourselves. The only way that we're going to improve as teachers is to actually do new things. If they don't work, they don't work. Refine it, change it, go back, do it again. So to step outside of the comfort zone and take responsibility for our own CPD in our hands, because at the end of the day, that's really the most that we can ask of teachers. Thank you very much. You've got a well-earned opportunity for some informal CPD amongst yourselves. Thank you very much. Good night.